Hello, everyone. My name is Benjamin Gross, and I am the Vice President for Research and Scholarship here at the Linda Hall Library in beautiful Kansas City, Missouri. It is my pleasure to welcome you to a special program organized in collaboration with the Society for the History of Technology, also known as SHOT. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, SHOT is an international organization devoted to the historical study of technology and its relations with politics, economics, labor, business, the environment, public policy, science, and the arts. SHOT members share their research in the Society's flagship journal, Technology and Culture, and at annual conferences. Now, today's talk actually traces its origins to the 2024 SHOT meeting, which was held last July in Viña del Mar, Chile. This year's conference theme was Repair in the History of Technology, and over the course of several days, participants considered how focusing on maintenance, rather than innovation, alters how we view the technologies that shape our lives, and the labor required to keep them running. Many of those scholars drew inspiration from our speaker today, Lee Vinsel. Lee is an associate professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech, and in 2016 he joined with Andrew Russell, who's now the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at SUNY Polytechnic Institute, to establish The Maintainers, a global research and practice network interested in the concepts of maintenance, infrastructure, repair, and the myriad forms of labor and expertise that sustain our human-built world. Lee is the author of two books, Moving Violations, Automobiles, Experts, and Regulations in the United States, which was published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2019, and, along with Andrew Russell, The Innovation Delusion, How Our Obsession with the New Has Disrupted the Work That Matters Most, which was published by Currency in 2020 and drew upon research that he conducted here at Linda Hall as a research fellow. Lee also hosts People and Things, a podcast where he interviews scholars, practitioners, and activists about human life with technology. In this afternoon's talk, Getting Maintenance Organized, Lee will reflect on the current state of maintenance studies before examining the roles that formal and informal organizations have played in the history of maintenance and repair. If you have any questions during the talk, feel free to paste them in the Q&A window on Zoom or the chat window on YouTube. For now, however, please join me in welcoming Lee Vinsel. Lee?
Thank you, Ben. Let me get my screen share going here, and then I will start talking. Ben, can you just confirm for me that you just see my slides?
I can indeed confirm. We can see your slides.
And not presenter view, right? Just my slides.
Not presenter view, just your slides.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ben. I want to thank the Linda Hall Library and the Society for the History of Technology for inviting me to give this talk. SHOT is mother, SHOT is father. Before I get going, I just wanted to pause for a moment and just take a second to acknowledge that I think we live in stressful times, and this has not just been true of the last few weeks, but for months and for years. And a lot of people in my life are really stressed out these days, and frankly, they are not doing so well. And if you're going through hard times right now, I just wanted to say that my heart goes out to you, and I wish you well. May you be well, and may your loved ones be well too. So when Ben and Amy Bix from SHOT asked me to do this talk some months ago, they wanted me to talk about maintenance, and I had to think, like, what do I want to say about maintenance studies and maintenance, the history of maintenance at this point in my life. And so I thought I would kind of go through three sections of thoughts. The first is talking about the maintainers, this group I helped start, and where maintenance studies is today. And then to talk a bit about the theme of maintenance in organizations, which is still a topic I think we need to know a lot more about and I'm interested in. And so I'll talk a bit about that and like things we can see about the history of the organization of maintenance and maintenance in formal organizations. And then going from that, I'll kind of zoom in on one theme that's interested me for a long time, which is the phrase operations and maintenance and its history and the way people have used it to shape organizations, the way organizations work for a long time. And you'll see in some of my slides, LHL, that stands for Linda Hall Library. And that means the source is something I found when I was a fellow at Linda Hall. And so this is just me doing, they're not paying me to do advertising, but I do want to say that I do believe Linda Hall is an excellent place to study these kinds of topics. So if you haven't gotten there and you're interested as a researcher, you're interested in topics like these and many others, it's a wonderful place to get to. So the maintainers thing and the state of maintenance studies, good news and bad news. So I was a part of starting this thing called the Maintainers in 2015, 2016, around there. And the reality is the Maintainers, which is this organization, the way we put it, is it's a global research and practice network interested in concepts of maintenance, infrastructure repair, and a myriad forms of labor and expertise that sustain our human-built world. The reality is that the Maintainers is not so much something I did or helped do, but kind of something that just kind of happened to my life without very much effort on my part. Really, this guy got it going. So this is Andy Russell. He's now a provost at SUNY Polytechnic Institute. So his life is basically over. But Andy was making jokes one day to me and my friend Brad Fiddler. And some of you have heard this story before, but I need to tell it one more time, I think, at least. And that is the book, Walter Isaacson's book, The Innovators, How a Group of Hackers, Geniuses, and Geeks Created a Digital Revolution, had just come out. And Andy suggested to me and Brad in an email, and in 2015, I'm pretty sure, I can find the date, that we create a counter volume to be called The Maintainers, How Bureaucrats, Standards Engineers, and Introverts Created Technologies That Kind of Work Most of the Time. And I was a blogger at that point, so I kind of wrote up the idea in a blog post and posted on Twitter in a couple different ways, and it just kind of took on a life of its own. We ended up holding the first Maintainers Conference in 2016 at Stevens Institute of Technology. And the same day that that came out, our essay, Hail the Maintainers, came out on Eon. The fall before that at SHOT, we had held a happy hour on the scene of Maintainers. We thought maybe like a dozen people were going to show up, but it was like a standing room only thing in a bar. And we're like, wow, something's really happening here. And oh, and by the way, I'm always happy to say that the Maintainers started as a happy hour that Linda Hall Library helped support for a couple of years, actually. So there's another wonderful Linda Hall connection. And from there, it just kind of took off. So it got picked up by all these publications like The Atlantic and The Guardian. And, eventually I was like giving talks at the Sydney Opera House. I was flown to Australia and New Zealand, and there was a Freakonomics radio episode. And eventually there was a New York Times op-ed, and the Innovation Delusion came out, which I forgot to screenshot. Now, I think that when the idea first got going, some people were in the field of like technology studies, and especially STS in the narrow sense of an organization called the whatever 4S is, were grumpy because people had actually been studying maintenance and repair in STS for like about a decade at least at that time. And I mean, this is just what happens when an idea gets going by making jokes on Twitter and you're not doing lit reviews. But, this is so in 2007, there was this great Graham and Thrift piece, Out of Order, Understanding Repair and Maintenance. And a couple years later, there's Jerome Denis and David Ponty. Their Materiality, Maintenance, and Fragility, The Care of Things. So, there were people thinking about this. There was also people like Steve Jackson of Cornell University, Daniela Rosner, who's at University of Washington, I'm sorry, and Laura Howson, who's based in the UK now. And so there was a lot of energy around this already, and I think Andy and I kind of built, kind of charged it in a new direction, and also made it kind of more pop or something like that. We also, Andy and I, when we wrote an essay for Technology and Culture called After Innovation Turn to Maintenance. And one of the things we did there, which came from great guidance from historians Arwen Moen and Roger Horowitz, was we made the story there about kind of building on traditions that were already existing in our literatures, but that maybe hadn't been brought out as clearly. And so part of what we were up to was a kind of creative rereading of sources like More Work for Mother by Ruth Cowan, this very famous book on domestic technologies, which can easily be conceived of as a kind of history of maintenance work. A lot of this housework is maintenance work. And fittingly, we had Ruth as the first keynote speaker at the first maintainers conference. And there, of course, we're also, I mean, another person we didn't totally kind of had a sense of where David Edgerton, what he has a book on, or a chapter on maintenance in his book, Shock of the Old. We kind of had a sense of this stuff in his work, but we really got to know David and his work much more deeply in after, the kind of things got rolling. And, I would say that David has become a mentor to me over the years, just because I think his work on these topics is so good. So right, I think that today there's a lot more work being done on maintenance. Probably the project I'm most excited about overall when it comes to maintenance is that Phil Scranton, who has written about maintenance both in his books on Hungary and on China, is writing a whole book about the history of spare parts in the 20th century, particularly from World War II onwards, but even before that. I'm really excited about that project. There's like Stefan Krebs and his colleagues have put out special issues. My colleague here at Virginia Tech, Fabian Prieto Nanez, is doing some really fascinating work on kind of television piracy and the use of satellite dishes in the Caribbean, and a lot of maintenance work involved in that. And, as Ben said, there's also, I was very sad to have to miss the last SHOT meeting in Chile, but repair was the central theme there. So I think we're seeing a lot of work being done. I think, if I remember correctly, there's at least an article and maybe a special issue coming out in Technology and Culture on maintenance and repair issues soon. So it just keeps going in a way. We also have great works like the wonderful MacArthur Genius Prize winning historian Pam Long, who I just had on the Peoples and Things podcast recently, put out this book, Engineering the Eternal City, Infrastructure, Topography, and the Culture of Knowledge in Late 16th Century Rome. And when she was writing that, I was in touch with her, and she was thinking a lot about maintenance. Maintenance comes through in that book in a lot of ways. And, there's other examples like Denis and Ponty have a book out on the kind of theoretical approach to maintenance. That I think is being translated in English soon. And there's a whole series of talks being held, still going on maintenance and the philosophy of technology by the Special Interest Group at the Society for the Philosophy and Technology, SPT. It's really wonderful. And Guru Madhavan, who I referenced his book on the last slide about wicked problems, how to engineer a better world. He's also writing a series of essays on what he calls grind challenges, which are these big, wicked engineering problems that involve a lot of maintenance work. So I think that in a sense, we're seeing a lot of blossoming around maintenance thought. But, just to be, I don't know, I Googled myself today because for a couple of years, when you would Google my name, Lee Vinsel, Andy Russell's photo would be the first thing that would come up. And I just love that. Like, that's me, right? Andy and I kind of merged, at least in the Google soul or something like that. But I was Googling myself today, and I loved it. Google had me down as Lee Vinsel, and then underneath my description was critic. I have no idea. What? Okay. But anyway, I do think part of my role in life is to, ask tough questions. And I think the reality is, just to say, like, I think there's also bad news when it comes to maintenance study. I think if the larger goal where the maintainer stuff comes from is a tack towards a use-centered history of technology, which is to say we're really putting use at the very center, we're still very far from a place of healthy balance when it comes to the history of technology and also all kinds of areas of STS, where it's all about emerging technologies and early invention and innovation stages. In this famous essay, From Innovation to Use, 10 Eclectic Theses on the Historiography of Technology by David Edgerton, he talks about how we need to focus on use. And I think it's in here that he refers to an essay by this guy, Svante Lindqvist, who talked about the life cycles of technology. So you can imagine, like, there's invention, early innovation, adoption, use takes up, and maybe at the end there's like decline and obsolescence or something like that. I think if we look in general at how people are still identifying topics in the history of technology and other areas of technology studies, it's often still very often focused on invention and early innovation stages. And I'm not saying we shouldn't study invention and innovation, those early innovation, that stuff's important too, but I just think the balance is way out of whack still. And just to give an example, I think that like computer history as a field, for example, you can just see it in the journals and the publications. It's all focused on the creation of software and machines. Like, here's this new computer system, here's that new computer system. And this is a problem, just to give a concrete example, because the economic effects of any technology, but including computers, arises from how people come to use technologies in everyday life, including to do their work. And if we don't have, for that reason, if we don't have use-centered histories of something like computing, we cannot have an answer for the so-called Solow paradox that economists have identified, which is that, during the period that the adoption of personal computers has been so intense for the 80s to the present, productivity improvements have been very low during that period, which means it seems like computers are not helping us that much do our work. Well, we, as historians, we have nothing to say about that unless we start doing use-centered history. So I still think there's a lot of work places to go. So where is the kind of maintainers team in the maintainers right now? Like I said, Andy became a provost, so I should do like taps here. It's like, bah, 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 bah. I mean, that's, Andy is a provost now. The organization is being led by these two great women, Liliana Calo and Laura DePena Frey. And right now, I think the organization is going through a real kind of questioning period. They've really focused on giving money to fellows. I think that's awesome, but there needs to be more funding coming in if there's going to be a continuation of the organization as it has been. So we'll see what happens there. Now, my current project builds directly out of the maintainers and the stuff and the innovation delusion, but I've gone in a slightly different direction, very related and overlapping, but a little different. When Andy and I were going to give a talk about the maintainers at the Hagley Center, archive and research center in Delaware, which is a great place, another great research center, we were contacted by this woman named Stephanie Hoops, who worked for United Way, the nonprofit organization, and she worked for this unit she'd created called United for Alice. I won't get into what Alice means, it's an acronym, but her group was finding that at about 40% of American households were having trouble making ends meet. And importantly, this includes a third of working households. And, she saw the connection between the maintenance work maintainers work that Andy and I were writing about, because she said a lot of the people, her Alice people, are maintainers. They're just poorly paid workers who keep our world going. And, her work and numbers really became really central to my life and the way I viewed things. And so I decided to kind of write a history book asking, well, why is it the case? And so my current book project has the tentative title, A Good History of Shit Jobs. And it is a history of poverty and economic hardship, especially amongst working households in the United States from the 1970s to the present. And so, there's lots of overlaps with maintenance stuff, but it's more about labor and work and the effect of technological change and industry sectoral change, the decline of, for instance, decline of manufacturing and employment and the rise of service sectors, stuff like that. Technology is in there in big ways. mostly in aggregate ways, but it's a slightly different direction. So that's where I'm at right now. I still love thinking about maintenance. Okay. And so I thought for a while I would talk through some things that I'm still interested in that I think that we don't know enough about, is what I would spend like 2/3 of the talk doing. And so I love getting maintenance organized. And in a sense, I just talked about getting maintenance studies organized in part one. Now I want to think about the organization of maintenance. And I think that here I want to kind of tip my hat to uh, the my teachers and Andy's teachers. And there, some of you may know this, but I studied with the great historian of technology and business, David Hounshell, who wrote From American System to Mass Production, and which is still the best history of mass production we have, I think. And he also co-wrote this book on the rise of R&D at the DuPont Corporation. And Andy was taught by Lou Galambos, who was a historian of organizations and business at Johns Hopkins, where Andy went, and I almost went. And so, and there's lots of overlaps here. Hounshell knew Galambos well. And I was taught Galambos' stuff by Hounshell in grad school. And so Andy and I both come from this vision of society that's very focused on the role of organizations. This includes big corporations, but as I'll get to in a moment, it includes lots of other things too. And, hanging in the background is the historian Alfred Chandler, who in this book, The Visible Hand, wrote about the rise of large corporations in the United States. And Chandler was a very close collaborator with Galambos and was a kind of mentor to Hounshell. So Chandler's hanging in the background here. And, as the subtitle to The Visible Hand says, it's about the rise of management, because Chandler kind of told a story of the rise of large organizations as a story of managerial change, of organizational and managerial change. Now, Chandler is like seen as not cool today. He's like way out of style. People love to hate on him who have never read him. So this is my best tweet of all time. I realized after I did this tweet that this is my whole life came up to do this tweet, and now I'm done. Like, I can retire and die now and everything's fine. And the joke here is this is the Hagley Center. Remember this other research institute I was telling you about? They put out this tweet hoping to get responses. What is the best thing about business history? And I said, it's Al Chandler. No, I don't, I'm being a little, sarcastic Vinsel here, but I'm also like trolling business historians. And this was like, it was such a sweet thing. So, but I do think Chandler hangs in the background of so much business history. And I'll show you how that's going to work in a second. And then before I get going here with the actual history and we get into some juicy primary sources, I want to say that even more than Chandler, what Andy and I are influenced is by Galambos's series of essays in that Creative Society book called The Organizational Synthesis. And as I already kind of alluded to, the picture here is that beginning in the mid to late 19th century in the United States and Europe and in other places in the world, you see this giant takeoff of the formation of organizations. Our society becomes more and more organized through the existence of formalized organizations, whether that's not, it's corporations, the state, nonprofits, and these other things that we have, we have laws around 503Bs and all these kinds of things, right? And so this is really an important part of my and Andy's understanding, and part of what drove what we were up to in the innovation delusion. Now, I want to say right off the bat that this looks really different depending on where you're studying in the world. And, and what organizations are and whether you have formal organizations and all these kinds of questions, it really depends on where you're at. I'm going to focus on the US, but I just want to say that, if we're looking at African maintenance, or what Fabian looking at Caribbean satellite dish maintenance, these things look very different, and there's lots of mixtures in between, what's called formal and what's called informal. But as I'm talking about like Jennifer Hart here, I think we also need to question these lines between formality and informality, and when we're thinking about organizations. Now, and I'm not going to focus on this in my talk, but I still think there's a huge amount of informal maintenance and repair work done in the United States. So I'm fascinated by these charts. These are n-grams showing word trajectories over time for repairman and handyman. And you can see that they both take off in the early 20th century. And this is right around the time that a lot more technologies are coming into households. And I think that's when we looked into these sources that are using these terms, that's what we're seeing is basically we're adopting a lot of technologies into domestic spaces, and they need to be fixed. Now, of course, some repair people have businesses and they have corporations, and it's all very formalized, but there's also lots of informal maintenance that is not like this at all. And I just want to kind of say that, like, around here, I hear a lot of stories about trailer parks, mobile home parks. And, there's very often stories of like the repair people who are just have the skills, and then they're helping each other out through a kind of, vision of solidarity and neighborliness and stuff like that. This is still very widespread in our society. So I'm not going to focus on that in my talk, but I think we need to be real that there's always a mixture of formal and informal organizational stuff going on. Now, part of the way I like to tell this story is that when we look at, I'm just going to say, go watch the movie Gunsmith of Williamsburg. I don't have time to go into what it is. But when we look at early craft production, like blacksmithing in the United States, or we look at this great book, A Midwife's Tale, we look at things like how people were handling maintenance of a home in the late 18th century, what we see is that the same people are producing and maintaining. This is really important, especially with blacksmiths. Like gunsmiths and blacksmiths not only are using their tools to produce things, they're also making their tools and maintaining and repairing their tools. They're the same person's doing all these things together. And so things begin to change with the rise of, I'm just going to call it industrial capitalism, with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, if you want to even use a worse term. And what we see is the rise of new maintenance-oriented, specialized maintenance-oriented roles and identities as human identities, ways of being in the world, and organizational bodies. So, one I've always liked, just because it's just fascinating with this organizational synthesis picture of the rise of formalized organization, is the rise of the word janitor as a specialized role. Which, organizations need a janitor to keep their building up or whatever. And so we have like not only the rise of this kind of word and identity, but also the rise of publications for these people. Okay. But now where do we see maintenance really get organized in the sense of, getting a lot of people together to coordinate them to do things and get things done? That sense of organization, of coordination of humans. Well, we see it in the railroad. And I spent a lot of time at the Linda Hall Library going through the volumes of the Roadmasters Association of America. Here's the volume from 1883. And this is really, I would say, like the first formal maintenance organization in the United States that I know of. And fittingly, I'll just say, here's Chandler. We can wish him away, but the ghost of Alfred Chandler. This is like in The Visible Hand, Chandler starts with the railroad. His story is a railroad-based story. And I don't think it's at all a coincidence that Chandler chooses the railroad to start his story of the large corporation. And we see that the railroad industry is where we first see the rise of formalized maintenance management. This is just what these guys look like, just to give you a sense of a 19th century maintenance manager. And this group is still around. Here's a screenshot from 2017. This group is now called the American Railway Engineering and Maintenance of Way Association. So just to give you a sense of the scale of problem, because often this was a Chandlerian story about why you need these formalized corporations and this organizational changes is that when you have the rise of big business, you have so many big problems to deal with. You have to sort things out, right? So just to give you a little sense of scale, by 1897, railroads owned more than 240,000 miles of track in the United States. There was 180,000 track workers and 20,000 foremen and 2,000 roadmasters, that's managers. Track and roadbed maintenance ate between 17 and 25% of total operating expenses, and roadmasters were overseeing 100 miles of track controlled about 100K annual expenditures, or 3 million today. So this is a big deal. I want to read you some select quotes. No, I don't want to do that one. I do like this one. So this is at their inaugural meeting. The first president, I. Burnett of Chicago, the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad, quoted the Bible to those gathered. It is not good for man to be alone. And, God says this right before he creates Eve, but Burnett used the sentiment to suggest that roadmasters should come together and share the best thoughts, the richest experience, the most worthy theories of each individual become the common property of all. New light is cast upon a dark problem that is the haunt in the mind of the individual for years. So this is the kind of vision of what they're going to do together. They're putting together, for instance, standard lists of what equipment you need when you're going to get this done. So they're trying to standardize all the forms of the operation. And then I just want to read you one more long quote from these guys. This is probably my favorite. This is about ditching, which is a form of maintenance these people were doing a lot. On the subject of ditching, I'll relate an anecdote told of one of the old engineers on the Pennsylvania Railroad, which is supposed to be one of the best railroads in America today and perhaps the world. A young man came to him to learn business of engineering. He told him to go over the line and see that the road was ditched. In about 6 months, the young man came back and said that the road was properly ditched. He said to the young engineer, "Go back and ditch the road again. The ditching of a road properly is something that is never finished." So there's these wonderful kind of like Buddhist, process vision, like philosophical statements coming out of these guys. Because this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to tame entropy, which is constantly tearing their systems apart. And I think we need to think about who are the managers managing. We can turn to Scott Reynolds Nelson's book and a lot of other books on the history of railroad labor. This is terrible work, and they're getting paid very little. It's abusive. I won't share the quotes today because I want to move on to the next section. But the road workers, the roadmasters are explicitly racist in how they're thinking about Mexicans and Italians and I'm sure Black people too, but it was more of an ethnic racism in the quotation I have. And so we need to be real that the managers are managing workers, right? And this is not easy work during this period. All right. And I just want to say these kind of organizations are still going on. And Andy and I were one of the coolest things we got to do was go around and give keynotes at maintenance conferences of maintenance professionals. And so I gave a keynote at this one, Mainstream. And really fascinatingly, if you've seen the photo here, this guy's holding a tablet. And the reality is that maintenance management conferences are a lot about software, because that's how you manage maintenance today is from maintenance management software systems. So that's where things are today. These organizations still exist. And just a couple other things before I want to move on to operations and maintenance. So I have a couple minutes for that. But we also see, if you want to think about the organization of maintenance, there's also the history of kind of maintenance standards in all these various areas, from nuclear power to software maintenance to aircraft maintenance. Fittingly, Linda Hall Library has some wonderful standards of the Department of the Maintenance of Way and Structures, publication from the American Society of Civil Engineers includes standardized railway maintenance limit signs. That's like end state maintenance here. That's where you put it. That's where maintenance ends. Not my responsibility from here on out. And, there's other things you can say about maintenance standards, including around janitorial work. And also we see the rise by the 1950s and 60s of maintenance consultants. I'm going to return to this in a second because a lot of these maintenance consultants, including these guys who wrote that book, came out of the military. And I'm going to talk about why that's important in 1 second here. All right, so that was, I think I still want to know a lot about this history of like how, I think we have not found a great corporate archive yet to look at the history of a maintenance department, or even kind of higher level executive considerations of how the maintenance department got created. Okay, I don't even think we have that yet. But I do want to, one thing that's really interested me for a long time, and I've always wanted to look more into, and so I took a couple of days to kind of poke around this, is the phrase operations and maintenance, because this is in a sense true. Part of the problem of the focus on invention and innovation is that so much of what businesses do in general is just get shit done. They just do things, okay? And this is what doing things is called operations. It's the operations. And so we don't have, even in like the entrepreneurship literature, a lot of other areas, really rich examinations of operations, let alone history of operations. So this is part of the tack that probably needs to happen. And so this is a phrase that goes way back. I've always been, where does this phrase operation maintenance or O&M? I should probably just do a Google Ngram for O&M. And here I was thinking about, to just kind of very lightweight, taking a kind of cultural history of science approach, thinking about like words like objectivity. I think we know from Foucault and all kinds of scholars over the last 50 years that you can write about the history of an idea and how people put it to work to do things in the world, and how those conceptions become part of a way of life, like Stephen Chapin's The Scientific Life. We could think about the manager way of life and the role that a notion of operations and maintenance plays in that way of life. What are they up to with this term? And I've done this with other things. Like I'm interested in the development of maintenance thinking in general. Like I'm interested in the history of preventive maintenance and how it takes off in the mid 20th century, why it came out of the railroad industry too. And, just here's a maintenance engineering from 1931 at Linda Hall Library, wonderful find of mine, where they had early publications on preventive maintenance and modern maintenance prevents breakdowns. And they were doing things like creating standardized preventive maintenance forms so that you could plan ahead, which is another very Chandlerian thing, planning. But I want to take a second and think about like this term operations and maintenance. So here's the Ngram from it. It pops up in the early 20th century, takes off in the 60s for some reason. Who knows why it falls off? I'm not interested in that right now. I didn't even look. I want to know about that where it comes from. And where I still haven't zeroed it in. I'm seeing it in a couple different places early on. So already in 1908, I see it in utilities. I think this makes a ton of sense that you have kind of the phrase operations and maintenance already being done in this, again, large organizations very often dealing with big capital intensive Chandlerian industry stuff. So that's one place I'm seeing it. I'm seeing it in the military. Apparently the British Admiralty adopted operations and maintenance as a term in 1917. And I love this. These two aspects, operations and maintenance, may be given a variety of names, but the fundamental distinction lies in the fact that the one is concerned with the use of the instrument, the other with its supply and maintenance in an efficient state. So this is what's happening with these terms, is realizing that you need to have different people and different groups in charge of getting things done and making sure the instruments are working to get things done. This is what we're seeing. We also see it in the US military by 1919, around the same time. And this is why I mention those consultants later on. I think a lot of maintenance thinking in the 20th century is a spillover from the military. Basically, it's military thinking going into domestic sectors, like so many other stories, like the internet and so many other technologies. Okay, if we look at Linda Hall Library's catalog, we put operations and maintenance, exact phrase, and then we organize by date. What are the first things that show up? It's the railroad. By at least the 1930s, they've adopted this term and have operations and maintenance department. This is very fitting. Again, here's dark Big Al Chandler saying, "I told you so." And we see it even even earlier in 1918, the American Association of American Railroads is doing it. So, and the last thing I want to say, I want to wrap up here so we can do Q&A. For us, operations and maintenance might seem like an old and stodgy term, but when it was introduced, it was caught up in this overall kind of like modernizing or rationalizing or organizing of organizations movement, and it felt fresh and new to people. And this continued for some time. So when I was reading last week, my favorite publication, Rural Electrification News, great pub, I found this article from 1950 called "We've Got Something in Common, Western Co-ops Exchange Ideas to Meet Squarely Management Problems." It's all about how these organizations, these Western electricity co-ops are not modern. They're not organized very well. And these ideas of operations and maintenance are coming in through these attempts to modernize it. So for these kind of Chandlerian middle management folks, this is exciting stuff. This is how they're trying to remake the world and make it more efficient and better and all those kind of classic engineering things. Now, the last thing I just want to say before I stop is modernizing is never done. And one of the most beautiful things Andy and I, just kind of the ethnographic things that came out of us hanging out at these maintenance professional conferences, is that so many organizations in the United States, in the public and private sector, including Virginia Tech, I'll just go out there and say it, their maintenance programs are not anywhere close to what you would expect to be ideal or kind of industry standard or any of these kinds of things. And so even though these ideas have been around for over 100 years at this point, that doesn't mean we necessarily do a very good job with them. And there's lots of reasons why that's true. I could go into that later if that's something people care about. But I think because I would like to get some questions and have some back and forth with folks, I'm going to stop there and talking about, the organization of maintenance. Oh, you're muted, bud.
Sorry about that. I thought I hit that button. Thank you so much, Lee. That was an outstanding talk. While I was muted, I was rambling about how much I enjoyed hearing about the various sources you consulted here at Linda Hall, and also the broader kind of historiographic arc of maintenance studies and the kinds of sources that you can use to answer these questions. Because as you've noted, the maintainers themselves, the people who are actually doing the repair work, it's hard to find them. There are some significant archival silences at times. So trying to figure out how to recover those stories, particularly, like with the folks who are working on the railroad, I think that it's really interesting to see kind of how you approach those challenges.
Yeah.
I'm pleased to report that we have a bunch of questions already in the chat. If you, audience, are interested in asking questions about maintenance or hearing more about what Lee's been working on, feel free to put them in the chat, in the Q&A window down at the bottom of the screen here on Zoom, or in the chat window on YouTube. And I think what I'll do is I'll start off because you referenced Amy Bix at the beginning. Amy actually was the first person to ask a question, so I'm going to pass this along. Lee, Amy writes, love your comments on the ongoing balance and imbalance between studies of innovation and use. Could you talk a bit about how this issue might relate to the ongoing debate over what some see as a worsening imbalance in the chronology of history of technology, where there's so much focus on 20th century or 21st century innovation and fewer researchers who are looking at topics pre-1900?
Yeah. I just want to say I agree with Amy's very sage symptomatology there. I think that this is very much part of the problem too. And I think you see it like, Pam Long's books, recent books have been very focused, maintenance has been a theme. And David Edgerton's now doing a long history of global production from the 19th century to the present or something like that. And, I think that taking these longer views also helps us think about the longer term of these things, which includes, things being around for a long time and you have to keep them going. So I think that that's very much a part of the issue here.
Fair enough. Another question that may be related to this that is in the chat right now from my colleague Tony Batasso. Do you know when the term deferred maintenance became popular?
Yeah, I actually I think I had a slide on that I skipped. That's another term that I'm totally fascinated with when it comes to the maintenance thinking. And it came if I remember correctly, it starts coming out in the 1920s, and it is also a railroad industry thing. Just to make another Chandlerian point here. So yeah, that's about when and where, I think. And then it spreads again to utilities and a lot of other places pretty quickly. Eventually it becomes part of the infrastructure conversation, obviously, but that's its story.
I'm being told now that that was actually being relayed by Tony from one of our research fellows, Allison Marsh, who wanted to hear more about
Oh,
that.
great.
Okay, another question from the chat. Antonis Ferris asks, thank you for the interesting talk. Is there any contemporary work on railway maintenance you will recommend, or even a team or division related to the maintainers network studying railway maintenance?
It's a really good question. Nothing's coming to mind off the top of my head. Unfortunately, I've talked to what's his name, Trella, the great historian of the Pennsylvania Rail, Art Trella. I can't remember. The great historian of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and those records just don't have that kind of stuff. And I think when it comes to historical studies, that's often our limit, is where are you going to find the archival sources? Yeah.
Fair enough. All right, we have another question from Jason Farman. Jason asks, one of the things I'd love to hear Lee talk about is the challenge of maintenance in an era when our objects are so dispersed. It's not just keeping the tech up and running, but the ecosystem it links out to, like data centers, servers, etc. It seems like an object is not the thing itself, but its ecosystem. Is this uniquely a part of our digital age, or is this a concern historically? That's a great question.
It is a good question. I mean, I think that there's obviously real change over time there, because beyond devices linked to electrical systems and telephones, it's not like we had a lot of devices in our everyday life that were linked directly to, I'm not talking about metaphorically to systems, but directly to these larger systems or via communication signal. But I think that, Joe, and to Jason's point, I mean, the longer historical trajectory is when you have these large systems, maintenance is always a part of the story. So one of the slides I skipped just for time is uh, just all these publications at Linda Hall Library. And it's almost like as industries emerge, large system industries emerge, publications about maintenance and repair are published within a couple years, because it's just part of it, right? And so I think Jason's question gets at that well. It really is all very often about systems. Large systems is where you see this organization stuff happening.
That makes sense. As a follow-up, I was curious, have the maintainers or you directly thought about the right to repair movement at all, or been involved with those discussions?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's another change over time thing too, is how corporations use like computers to lock down repair. We write about that in the Innovation Delusion, and I really like what I call the trifecta, or the triune of the right to repair movement. Nathan Proctor of US PIRG, Kyle Wines of iFixit, and Gay Gordonburn of the Repair Coalition are just wonderful, fascinating folks. And so, yeah, we've been very much involved in those conversations, and its ties to history are fascinating. But I'll go on to other questions before I just keep going on that.
That's fair. And I'm pleased to report we have a couple of more questions from current and former Linda Hall Library Fellows, which is great. So, Ramya Swayam Prakash, who is one of our current fellows, has a kind of a running comment, I guess, a running thought. So, this is a sort of running thought. So, pardon me. I study dredging and maintenance in the Great Lakes. I
Yeah.
wonder if there's been any work on maintenance, dredging, and emergent industrial lobbies.
I don't think we have anything on that specifically, but I just want to say that I love this as a topic. My father what ended his career as a land surveyor, but when I was a little kid, he was a water surveyor. And what actually brought me from Ohio to Illinois was him working on the US or the Illinois Sanitary Canal, which is also the Chicago River. And basically he was doing surveying to doing dredging. Dredging is obviously a form of maintenance labor. I would love to hear you reflect on this, Ramya, at some point, because I think the question of how this connects to emergent industrial lobbies is awesome. I hope you've talked to Richard John about this because he had a student looking at this at one point. And if you don't know who Richard is, please drop me an email and I will connect you to him.
Excellent. I hope that you're able to start up a broader conversation about this because I think it's an area that would merit further investigation. Another one of our recent fellows, Sebastian Rose, has this question. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. Could you talk a bit more about the connection between labor movements and the rise of maintenance in the 19th century? Did the standardization of maintenance play a role in changing labor militancy, etc.?
Yeah, well, I think I'm probably going to end up saying this for the rest of the time, but Sebastian, I would love to talk to you more about this at some point. I don't think we have enough on we don't have nearly enough on the labor side of the maintenance story. And here's just a really interesting factoid. I mean, there's always a question of where maintainers fit in an organizational hierarchy. And my friend Bjorn Westergaard has told me before that in the early 20th century, maintainers were often very high up in union leadership, and it's because maintainers his theory is that they went all over the organization fixing things, and so they knew everybody. They're great social networkers. So I think the connection between maintenance and formal labor movements of all sorts is a great topic that I would just wish we just had a whole conference on that. That would be wonderful.
I mean, we can add that to the list as a possibility.
There you go.
All right, we have a few more minutes left if people do want to ask questions. I'm monitoring both the Q&A window here on Zoom and the chat window on YouTube. Um, in the short term, I'd like to kind of circle back a second, Lee, to a kind of thread that we're noticing in a couple of these questions here. We talked about just with Ramya and Sebastian's question, some areas that need further investigation or that are that would benefit from further kind of historical scholarship. Are there sectors that have been more heavily focused on when it comes to maintenance studies? And you could think about that in the context of like an industrial sector, or I guess getting back to Amy's question about time period, like are we
Yeah.
getting more maintenance in the 20th and 21st centuries?
Yeah.
Or there's a geography question. I mean, I'd love to hear a little bit more about kind of
Right.
maintenance in other parts of the world.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, okay. Yeah, I think if there's an area that has the most research on maintenance, it is digital stuff. I think software and computing, and that fits Amy's question. I mean, that's, SIGSIS, the computer history organization, has kind of become the tail that wags the dog of the Society of the History of Technology. There's so much history of computing being done these days. So, I mean, I think that a lot of that works great. I don't want to like play it down at all. It's just that I think that we need to rebalance uh, these kind of sectoral stories. And then, yeah, I mean, I think that, I wanted to tell the story this way for a few reasons, including because it allowed me to use some of my Linda Hall material. And I still am very interested in just this organizational story that I think we know almost nothing about, frankly. Um, but I think I firmly believe that the most important thing happening in STS, no, the history of technology and STS in the normal 4S sense or the narrow 4S sense is really the internationalization of the research being done and just bringing in so many other places in the world, and so that I'm always interested in that too. And I'll say that I think if we went back through the fellows of the maintainers organization, um, uh, they have done, they've funded fellows in other parts of the world, and that was very explicit, the point.
Amy was
Um,
kind enough to add in another comment here.
yeah, go.
If we're looking explicitly at gender, right? As she writes, that was one of the reasons I loved researching the history of home equipment studies and women's home repairs.
Yeah.
It doesn't fit into the framework of unions, Chandlerian corporations, which are absolutely vital. I don't think anyone wants to disparage Chandler today, especially not after that defense. That was my editorializing, not Amy's comment, I
Yeah,
should
yeah, yeah.
point out. But Amy continues, I wish more historians of technology engaged with the history of home economics.
Yeah, and actually like that was in my earlier version of this talk, not an earlier version, in the talk that I gave as a fellow earlier, that I used as the basis for some of these slides. Let me see if I can show this stuff. I had a whole section on the home ec side of this story, which is also nicely documented in uh in Linda Hall's collection. So let me just throw up some of that. I mean, I agree. I think, like I said, I wanted to tell this story the way I did for a couple different reasons. But there's always more great research to be done. And I think that this kind of home side of the story is definitely among them. And so this is just kind of, there's a lot of stuff like the National Bureau of Standards is putting out publications in the 1930s on the care and repair of the home. Wonderful stuff. And we also have books like this from 49, Household Equipment, that show you how to fix stuff, the complete home handyman's guide. So I think that there's obviously a lot to be done on the kind of uh, um, on the home ec side of the story, and there's always gender. You can bring into gender. I mean, you can bring gender into the stuff I was doing today. It's very populated by man speak. So there's that kind of masculinity studies stuff to be done, and then how this. I mean, one of the reasons we don't just talk about maintenance or repair, but we'd also talk about care work like nursing in the innovation delusion, is because we realized if we just focused on narrow maintenance repair, it was going to be a dude book.
Hmm.
And we think that probably if you include care, women are doing more maintenance work broadly construed than men are in lots of societies around the world. So I think there's always more to be done on this kind of analysis as well. Yeah, for sure.
So it looks like we're almost at the top of the hour, but before we wrap up, I did want to ask you if people are interested in learning more about the maintainers or pursuing this kind of research, what are some suggestions you might give them in terms of next steps?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still going to maintainers.org, and we have a listserv you can sign up for on there. I think that's still, it's kind of been quiet recently, but it's still a great resource to send questions to around literature and stuff. And then, everyone in the network's friendly, so you can also just reach out to me in a whatever way on, via email or social media or LinkedIn or whatever. So, and that goes for other members of the maintenance studies world too, I'm sure.
All right. Well, I think that's a wonderful way to kind of wrap things up. Uh, Please join me, ladies and gentlemen, one more time in thanking Lee Vinsel for this outstanding discussion. We probably could have kept, Lee and I have now known each other for a while. We probably could have kept talking about this for another
Hours.
probably
Yeah.
hour. Um, but I do encourage you, if you haven't seen his book, the one that he wrote with Andy Russell, who I should have noted was a provost. I'm so sorry for
No, it
misstating
doesn't
his
matter.
title. It's definitely worth taking a look at the innovation delusion. It's a lot of it, I mean, it's a lot of fun to read, but it also makes some really important points, which I think are going to be only more relevant as we move forward with ongoing debates about all of these questions about infrastructure and maintenance and repair. So that'll wrap us up for today here at the Linda Hall Library. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Please visit us at lindahall.org if you'd like to learn more about upcoming events or fellowships like the one that Lee had that helped him build this presentation today. We also are on all the socials, so feel free to look around and follow us there. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day wherever you are, and hopefully we'll cross paths again soon. Take care. Bye for now, everybody.